We are often fascinated by stories of evil, the kind that shakes us to our core, the kind that forces us to question everything we thought we knew about human nature. And few names evoke such visceral reactions as Ted Bundy. To this day, his case continues to provoke fear, confusion, and morbid curiosity. How can someone who, on the surface, seemed so normal, so charming, commit such unimaginable acts? How can evil hide behind such a pleasant mask? In this journey, I want to explore the psychology of evil through the lens of Ted Bundy's life. But this is not just a story about one man. It's a story about us, about humanity, and about the dark potential that lurks within each of us. To understand someone like Bundy is to confront the terrifying possibility that evil is not something external, something other. It might reside within us, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. When we ask ourselves, how can someone like Ted Bundy exist, we are really asking, what does it mean to be human? Are we inherently good, or do we all carry within us the seeds of destruction? What makes someone cross that line, and could any of us do the same? Bundy was, by many accounts, the last person anyone would suspect of being a serial killer. He was intelligent, well-spoken, and even likable. He had a bright future ahead of him: law school, political aspirations, and a seemingly normal life. But beneath that facade, there was something deeply wrong. He was a predator, a manipulator, and a killer. And while we're horrified by his actions, we must also ask ourselves, how did someone like Bundy come to be? This is not a simple question, and there is no easy answer. But if we look at Bundy through the lens of psychology, we start to see patterns emerge. One of the most striking things about Bundy was his complete lack of empathy. He could charm people, manipulate them, and even convince them to trust him, but he never truly cared about anyone but himself. This lack of empathy is one of the hallmark traits of psychopathy, a personality disorder characterized by shallow emotions, a grandiose sense of self-worth, and a tendency to manipulate others for personal gain. But psychopathy alone does not explain Bundy's evil. After all, not all psychopaths become serial killers. So what pushed Bundy to commit such horrific acts? To understand that, we need to look at the concept of moral disengagement. This is a psychological process in which individuals justify their harmful actions by disconnecting from the moral consequences of their behavior. In Bundy's case, he was able to convince himself that his victims were objects, mere tools for his own gratification. He did not see them as human beings with their own thoughts, feelings, and lives. In his mind, they were disposable.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound spiritual lesson.
But even this does not fully explain Bundy's actions. There is something deeper, something more primal at play. Bundy himself once said, "We serial killers are your sons, we are your husbands, we are everywhere, and there will be more of your children dead tomorrow." He understood that the line between good and evil is not as clear-cut as we would like to believe. He knew that the potential for evil exists in all of us, and that under the right circumstances, anyone could be capable of committing unspeakable acts. So what are those circumstances? What are the conditions that allow evil to flourish? One answer lies in the concept of dehumanization, when we stop seeing others as human beings, with their own dignity and intrinsic worth. It becomes much easier to justify harming them. History is full of examples of this. From genocides to wars to everyday acts of cruelty, dehumanization is a powerful psychological mechanism that allows us to commit evil without feeling guilt or remorse. But this still leaves us with a disturbing question: How can someone like Bundy dehumanize others so completely? And could we, under the right circumstances, do the same? This is where we must confront an uncomfortable truth: the capacity for evil may be closer to the surface than we think. We like to believe that we are fundamentally good, that we are incapable of committing acts of violence or cruelty. But history and psychology tell us otherwise. Given the right combination of factors: stress, fear, anger, a sense of powerlessness, we may all be capable of crossing that line. So, where does that leave us? How do we reconcile the fact that evil is not some external force, but something that exists within us all? This is a question that philosophers, psychologists, and theologians have wrestled with for centuries. Some, like the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, argue that we are radically free, that we are responsible for our own actions, and that evil arises when we fail to take responsibility for the choices we make. Others, like Sigmund Freud, believe that evil is the result of repressed desires and unconscious drives, bubbling up from the darkest corners of our psyche. But no matter which theory we subscribe to, the fact remains that Bundy's story forces us to confront some deeply uncomfortable truths about ourselves. We live in a world that is not as black and white as we would like to believe. Good and evil are not clear-cut categories. They are messy, complex, and often intertwined. And if we are to prevent future tragedies like those committed by Bundy, we must first understand the conditions that allow evil to take root. Now, I want to pause here and ask you, what would you do if you were in Bundy's shoes? Could you say with absolute certainty that you would never cross that line? Or is there a part of you that fears what you might be capable of under the right circumstances? This is not an easy question to answer, but it is one that we must grapple with if we are to truly understand the nature of evil. As we continue this exploration, we must now confront another uncomfortable reality: the line between sanity and madness is often much thinner than we think. Ted Bundy was not a raving lunatic. He was not someone who could easily be dismissed as crazy or insane. In fact, that's what makes his story so chilling. He was, by all outward appearances, a normal, functioning member of society. And yet, beneath that veneer of normalcy, there was something deeply, profoundly wrong. So, what is it that separates someone like Bundy from the rest of us? Is it simply a matter of brain chemistry, of genetics, of some fundamental flaw in his biology that made him incapable of feeling empathy or remorse? Or is there something more existential at play, something that speaks to the very nature of what it means to be human? One of the most troubling aspects of Bundy's case is the way in which he seemed to revel in his own evil. He was not just indifferent to the suffering of others, he seemed to take pleasure in it. This is what psychologists call sadistic personality disorder, a condition in which individuals derive pleasure from inflicting pain on others. But even this does not fully explain Bundy's actions. After all, many people with sadistic tendencies do not go on to become serial killers. So what was it that drove Bundy to such extremes? One possibility is that he was driven by a deep, existential void, a sense of meaninglessness, of emptiness, of a profound disconnection from the world around him. In his interviews, Bundy often spoke of feeling like an outsider, of not belonging, of being somehow fundamentally different from other people. This sense of alienation is a common theme among those who commit acts of extreme violence. They feel disconnected from society, from other people, and ultimately from themselves. But this raises another question: what causes someone to become so disconnected from their own humanity? One answer lies in the concept of moral injury. This is a psychological condition in which individuals experience deep, existential pain as a result of violating their own moral code. In Bundy's case, it is possible that his actions were a way of coping with his own sense of moral injury. By dehumanizing his victims, by treating them as objects rather than as human beings, he was able to distance himself from the emotional and psychological consequences of his actions. But this still does not fully explain Bundy's evil. After all, many people experience moral injury without becoming serial killers. So what was it that made Bundy different? One possibility is that he was driven by a deep existential fear, a fear of meaninglessness, of insignificance, of death. In his interviews, Bundy often spoke of feeling like he was running out of time, of needing to prove himself in some way. This sense of existential dread is a common theme among those who commit acts of extreme violence. They are driven by a desire to assert their own power, to impose their will on the world, to prove that they exist. But this raises yet another question: could any of us be driven to such extremes by the same existential fears? Could we, under the right circumstances, be capable of committing acts of evil in order to assert our own existence? This is a question that goes to the very heart of what it means to be human. And it is a question that we must confront if we are to truly understand the nature of evil. As we reach the final part of this exploration, I want to turn our attention to a question that has haunted humanity for centuries: can someone like Ted Bundy ever be redeemed? Is there a possibility of salvation for those who have committed acts of such unspeakable evil? Or are they, as many believe, beyond redemption, lost forever in the darkness of their own souls? This is not just a question about Bundy. It is a question about all of us. Is there a point at which we become irredeemable? Or is there always hope for redemption, no matter how far we have fallen? This question of redemption, particularly for someone like Ted Bundy, takes us into the heart of one of the most difficult and profound philosophical dilemmas. In many religious traditions, redemption is always possible. Christianity, for instance, speaks of forgiveness even for the most heinous sins, provided there is genuine repentance. But what does it mean to repent when the evil is so great, so pervasive, and so seemingly central to one's identity? Can someone who has inflicted so much suffering ever truly change, or are they forever defined by their actions? Ted Bundy, in his final days, claimed to have found God. In his last interview, he spoke about how pornography had fueled his violent fantasies and how he had come to regret his actions. But can we trust these words? Were they simply the final manipulations of a man who knew his time was up, or was there some genuine spark of remorse in him? And even if he did feel remorse, was it enough to outweigh the immense suffering he had caused? These are difficult questions, and they force us to grapple with the limits of our own capacity for forgiveness. But perhaps the more important question is not whether someone like Bundy can be redeemed, but whether we as a society are capable of imagining such redemption. Can we envision a world where even the most broken among us are given the chance to heal? Or do we believe that some people are simply beyond saving? This is not just a question about criminal justice or punishment. It's a question about how we see humanity itself. Is there an inherent value in every human life, no matter how corrupted it may become? Or are there some lines that, once crossed, can never be uncrossed? Bundy's case forces us to consider the nature of evil not just as an abstract concept, but as something that can manifest in the minds and actions of real people. It pushes us to ask whether evil is an inherent quality, something that defines certain individuals, or whether it is a product of circumstance, environment, and choice. If evil is inherent, then perhaps someone like Bundy is beyond redemption. But if evil is something that arises from choices, no matter how dark, does that mean there is always the possibility of choosing differently, of choosing good? This leads us to a profound philosophical question. Is there a point at which someone is no longer capable of moral choice? Bundy's life seems to suggest that, for some individuals, the capacity for moral reasoning becomes so twisted, so disconnected from reality, that they are no longer capable of making ethical decisions. But if that's the case, then what does it say about free will? Are we all truly free to choose good or evil? Or are some of us trapped by our biology, our psychology, our past traumas? This is not just a question about Bundy. It's a question about all of us. We like to believe that we are in control of our actions, that we can choose to be good or evil. But what if that's not entirely true? What if, for some people, the forces of biology, upbringing, and trauma are so overpowering that they are no longer capable of making free choices? And if that's the case, how do we judge them? How do we hold them accountable for actions that they may not have been fully responsible for? There's no easy answer to these questions, but they are important ones. They force us to confront the limits of our own understanding of morality and human nature. They challenge us to think about justice, not just in terms of punishment, but in terms of compassion and understanding. And they push us to ask, what would we do if we were in Bundy's position? Could we say with certainty that we would never fall into the same darkness? Or is there a part of us that fears what we might be capable of under the right or wrong circumstances? Bundy's story also raises the question of responsibility. To what extent are we, as a society, responsible for the creation of someone like Bundy? He did not grow up in a vacuum. He was shaped by his environment, by his experiences, by the culture around him. And while this does not excuse his actions, it forces us to ask whether we could prevent future tragedies by changing the conditions that give rise to such evil. What is it about our society that allows people like Bundy to slip through the cracks, to go unnoticed until it's too late? What could we do differently to catch these warning signs earlier, to intervene before the darkness takes over? This brings us back to the concept of empathy, or rather, the lack of it. Bundy's inability to empathize with his victims is often cited as one of the key factors in his descent into evil. But empathy, or the lack thereof, is something that can be nurtured or stunted by one's environment. If we want to prevent future tragedies, we need to foster a culture of empathy, of connection, of understanding. We need to teach people, from a young age, to see others not as objects or obstacles, but as human beings with their own intrinsic worth. And yet, this is easier said than done. In a world that often rewards selfishness, competition, and power, how do we cultivate empathy on a societal scale? At the same time, we must also confront the darker side of human nature. As much as we would like to believe that we are all inherently good, the reality is that we are also capable of great evil. The line between good and evil is not as clear-cut as we might think. It is a fluid boundary, one that can shift depending on circumstances, pressures, and choices. Bundy's story forces us to confront this uncomfortable truth. It shows us that evil is not something out there, something that only exists in monsters or psychopaths. It is something that exists within all of us, lurking just beneath the surface. This is not to say that we are all potential serial killers, but it is to say that the capacity for cruelty, for dehumanization, for violence, is a part of the human condition. And if we want to prevent future tragedies, we need to acknowledge this reality. We need to stop thinking of people like Bundy as anomalies, as aberrations, and start thinking about the ways in which our society, our culture, and even our biology can contribute to the creation of such evil. In the end, the story of Ted Bundy is not just a story about one man. It is a story about all of us. It is a story about the darkness that exists within the human soul and the thin veneer of civilization that keeps it at bay. It is a story about the choices we make, the forces that shape us, and the ways in which we can sometimes lose control of our own humanity. But it is also a story about hope, because if we can understand the conditions that give rise to evil, we can also work to change them. We can create a society that fosters empathy, that teaches people to see humanity in others, that intervenes before it's too late. We can create a world where people like Bundy never have the opportunity to descend into such darkness. So as we conclude this journey, I leave you with one final question. What will you do to ensure that evil does not take root in your own life, in your own community, in your own world? How will you contribute to a society that fosters empathy, understanding, and connection, rather than one that breeds isolation, dehumanization, and violence? The choice is yours. The future is in your hands. As we continue to grapple with these deep and unsettling questions, it's essential to recognize that the story of Ted Bundy and the broader exploration of evil forces us to look inward. The discomfort we feel when we confront the reality of someone like Bundy is more than just revulsion at his specific crimes. It's a profound unease with the acknowledgement that, under the right circumstances, any of us might be capable of moral transgression. This isn't to suggest that we would all become serial killers, but rather to point out that the capacity for cruelty, for indifference, and for moral blindness exists within us all. Bundy's life reveals something fundamental about the human condition, that the boundary between good and evil is often more porous than we are willing to admit. Most of us live our lives without ever having to confront or even acknowledge the darker aspects of our own nature. But Bundy's story forces us to reconsider this. It forces us to ask, what am I capable of? This question is terrifying because it challenges the comforting narrative that we are always in control of our actions, that evil is something other that exists outside of ourselves. But as history has repeatedly shown, from the atrocities of war to the everyday acts of cruelty we witness or participate in, evil is not always as distant as we would like to believe. It can emerge in moments of weakness, fear, and anger. It can arise from a failure to empathize, to recognize the humanity in others. And, in extreme cases like Bundy's, it can spiral into unimaginable violence. But what does this mean for us, practically speaking? How can we take this uncomfortable knowledge and use it to create a better world? The first step is, perhaps, the hardest, acknowledging that the potential for evil exists within each of us. This doesn't mean we are all doomed to commit horrific acts, but it does mean that we must remain vigilant. We must actively cultivate empathy, compassion, and self-awareness to prevent the seeds of cruelty from taking root. This cultivation of empathy is not just a personal responsibility, it's a societal one. Bundy's story is a stark reminder of the consequences of a culture that, all too often, rewards narcissism, power, and domination over others. He thrived in a society that valued appearance and charm over substance and morality. He manipulated people's perceptions of him, using his good looks and intelligence to hide his inner darkness. And in this, we see a reflection of the broader problem: our tendency to prioritize superficial qualities over genuine ethical character. If we want to prevent future tragedies like those committed by Bundy, we need to rethink what we value as a society. We need to create a culture that prizes empathy, that encourages people to connect with one another on a deeper level, that teaches us to see beyond the surface and recognize the humanity in everyone. This is no small task, and it requires a fundamental shift in how we approach everything from education to media to politics. One of the key lessons from Bundy's life is that evil does not always announce itself with a snarl or a sneer. Often it wears a smile. It hides behind charm, intelligence, and social success. This is why it is so important to develop a deeper understanding of human behavior, to recognize the warning signs of dehumanization and cruelty, even when they are masked by a pleasant exterior. In Bundy's case, many people were fooled by his outward appearance, assuming that someone so normal could not possibly be capable of such atrocities. But this assumption rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of evil. It is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it is quiet and insidious, lurking beneath the surface. So how do we guard against this? How do we ensure that we don't fall into the trap of mistaking appearances for reality? One answer lies in fostering critical thinking and emotional intelligence. We need to teach ourselves and our children to look beyond the surface, to question assumptions, to empathize with others, and to recognize the humanity in everyone. This means cultivating a mindset that values depth over superficiality, substance over style, and empathy over ego. But even as we work to foster this deeper understanding, we must also acknowledge that there will always be individuals who, for one reason or another, fall through the cracks. People like Bundy will continue to exist, and we will never be able to fully predict or prevent every act of evil. This is perhaps one of the most difficult truths to accept, that despite our best efforts, there will always be darkness in the world. But this doesn't mean we should give up. On the contrary, it means we must work even harder to build a society that minimizes the conditions in which evil can thrive. This brings us to the role of compassion in the face of evil. How do we respond to individuals like Bundy? Do we view them as irredeemable monsters, or do we attempt to understand them, to see them as human beings who have lost their way? This is not to excuse their actions or to diminish the suffering they have caused, but rather to recognize that dehumanizing them only perpetuates the cycle of violence and cruelty. If we are to create a more compassionate world, we must be willing to extend empathy even to those who seem least deserving of it. But how do we do this in a way that does not excuse or enable evil? How do we balance empathy with accountability? This is one of the most difficult philosophical and ethical challenges we face. On the one hand, we must hold individuals accountable for their actions. Justice demands that those who commit harm face the consequences. But on the other hand, we cannot lose sight of their humanity, even when they have lost sight of it themselves. One approach is to recognize that empathy and accountability are not mutually exclusive. We can hold people accountable for their actions while still striving to understand the factors that led them down the path of evil. In Bundy's case, we can acknowledge the horror of his crimes while also recognizing that his lack of empathy, his manipulative tendencies, and his sadistic impulses likely arose from a complex interplay of genetic, psychological, and environmental factors. This understanding does not excuse his actions, but it does provide valuable insights into how we might prevent similar tragedies in the future. At the same time, we must also confront the limits of our own empathy. There will always be people for whom forgiveness seems impossible, for whom redemption feels out of reach, and perhaps that's okay. Perhaps it's not always our role to forgive, especially when we are not the ones who have been directly harmed. But even if we cannot always extend forgiveness, we can still strive to understand. We can still work to create a society that fosters empathy, that values human connection, and that seeks to prevent the conditions that give rise to evil. In the end, the story of Ted Bundy is not just a cautionary tale about the dangers of evil. It's also a story about the fragility of our own humanity. It reminds us that the line between good and evil is not as clear-cut as we might like to believe, and that we must constantly work to cultivate empathy, compassion, and understanding in ourselves and in others. It challenges us to look beyond the surface, to question our assumptions, and to confront the uncomfortable truth that, under the right circumstances, any of us could be capable of crossing that line. But it also offers us hope, because if we are willing to confront these difficult truths, if we are willing to do the hard work of cultivating empathy and understanding, then we can create a world where the conditions for evil are minimized. We can build a society that values human connection, that recognizes the intrinsic worth of every individual, and that seeks to prevent the dehumanization that leads to acts of cruelty and violence. So as we leave this exploration of Bundy and the dark side of human nature, I urge you to continue asking yourself the difficult questions: what am I capable of? What can I do to cultivate empathy and understanding in my own life? How can I contribute to a society that fosters compassion rather than cruelty? These are not easy questions, but they are essential ones. And in asking them, we take the first steps toward creating a world where the darkness within us does not take over.